These are the stories of a young wandering Brent Taylor, a Navy junior whose father was a naval officer and whose mother was a society lady. The earliest childhood memories I have take place actually in Pasadena, California, at my grandmother's house, where we would have such a good time, my sister Sally and I, and where we would sit at the dining room table, a large table, all by ourselves, and we would wait for the servants to bring our food to us from the kitchen. And if they didn't come, we would push a button under the table and they would come out and bring us things. And we loved that, had a big smile on our face. Well, one day, my grandmother heard about this in some fashion, and she came out and she was very angry with us. And at the same time, telling us not to tease the help. She noticed that we had our elbows on the dining room table, so she took a spoon and smacked our elbows, and I can still feel it in my little finger. That was a beautiful place, 465 South Grand Avenue, Pasadena, California. A big colonial mansion with a backyard, with a swimming pool, and if you went a little further, you looked down into a big, long ravine that eventually led you actually to the Rose Bowl. But we couldn't see it from our house. But it was really a pretty neat place. Anyhow, those are some of the first memories. Another first memory I have, and wouldn't you know this would happen to me, it was actually the day that Germany declared war, and by invading Poland in 1939, and so the Allies declared war on Germany. My father was on the telephone. We were living at the time in Coronado, California. My father was on the telephone talking to the Navy Department people back in Washington, D.C., and I came wandering in from playing outside and climbed up on a chair by the fireplace, looked up on the mantelpiece, and there was a projectile called a 1-pounder, which was a large bullet from World War I that had been in my mother's possession for a long time and thought to be totally dud. Well, I asked my dad what it was. He was busy on the phone. He waved me off and said, "Put it back." I put it back, not quite far enough, and it tipped off the shelf, fell to the brick hearth, and exploded. And it blew the chair apart that I was standing on. And fortunately, I was on that chair and not on the brick hearth. But it did send a piece of shrapnel across my lip up to my nose and cut me rather severely there, and knocked a hole in the roof. So that ended my dad's phone call and caused great consternation with my mother, and everybody came to rescue me. Some other World War II stories that come to mind have to do with being a lookout. My buddy and I, who lived nearby, had two places that we would go to when we were not in school. A big tree down the street on Alameda Boulevard, and the Hotel del Coronado, which is a very elegant old hotel. And we would go to the hotel, climb to the very top, sit there eating Jell-O granules from a Jell-O box, and watch out for Japanese aircraft coming from the west. Well, we never saw any Japanese aircraft, and we're not really sure what we would have done if we had. But I say it sufficed that we were on guard duty, and the Japanese probably knew that. Across from our house on Alameda Boulevard was a horse trail, and the horse trail went around a golf course. But as the horses came by our house, our dog, Puck, would often jump the back fence, get out in the front, and chase those horses. He would grab them by the tail, and they would buck up in the air and occasionally throw their rider. Well, we got complaints from the police, and finally, after several of those, the mayor in the town ordered my dog away, said he was dangerous and he had to leave town. It just so happened that my father had a good friend who was sailing on an aircraft carrier and was preparing to go over to Japan. So my dad sent my dog over there to be onto the aircraft carrier, which I think was leaving from Seattle, Washington, to be the mascot. So for at least a year of the war, he was a mascot on board the aircraft carrier Sitco Bay. It turns out that he had a service record just like all the sailors on the ship did. He had his own little paw print and a picture. And one of the entries on his in his service record was that it was claimed that he was the first dog into Tokyo Bay for the signing of the peace accords with the Japanese. Another story in Coronado was the fact that our police chief, on his birthday, would take all the children in the town out to the movies. And naturally, we wanted to see a World War II movie. So he'd take us to the movies, and then he'd take us and buy us all ice cream and tell us to be good. That was cool. Now, over in San Diego, there was a great big aircraft plant, a Lockheed aircraft plant. And we would go in that direction on a ferry boat from Coronado in my mom's car. My dad, of course, being away at the war. And as we would leave the ferry in San Diego and proceed up the highway, we would have this marvelous picture of this entire plant, aircraft plant, covered in netting and covered in fake houses, trees, and other things. So that the Japanese, if were they to fly over San Diego, would not be able to fully identify the Lockheed plant, everybody thought. I like that. Normally we would do that on the way to my grandmother's house. And up at my grandmother's we would have a good time, some of which I've already explained to you. And that's about it for the earliest days in Coronado, with the exception of the fact that I did have a couple of bad, knowing me, bicycle accidents. One of which I was speeding along a freshly graveled road, and my bike zoomed out from underneath me and I tore up my knee. And another time I was riding my bicycle, and a couple of girls I knew from the elementary school were walking along the sidewalk. And in order to show off for them, I looked at them and I rode with no hands. And I had this big smile on my face as I went by. Unfortunately, there was a parked car just beyond them. And I ran up right the back of that parked car. And my dignity was hurt more than anything else, as I recall. Now, we moved to Jacksonville, Florida in 1946 from Coronado. And that was a nice place, really, very nice. And I had such great adventures in Jacksonville. Let me see, I'll tell you a couple of them. First of all, we used to ride our bikes, my buddy and I, and we'd ride them along the main street in front of what they called Gold Coast officers' housing. And at that time, the German prisoners of war that were being held at Naval Air Station would march down that street singing German songs and carrying rakes and shovels on their shoulders as they went off to do a variety of gardening at the various houses and throughout the Naval Air Station. So when we would ride by them, we would hold up our right hand like a Heil Hitler, and we would put our left hand across our nose like Hitler's mustache, and we would yell Heil Hitler to them, and they would laugh, and we would ride on. And we did this a number of times, so they knew we were coming, and it was a mutual enjoyment, I think, for both of us. The German prisoners were in no hurry to go back home to Germany. The repatriation of POWs from America to Germany went on for several years. The main reason being that there was no housing in Germany to return them to. So they were returned in a kind of a trickle fashion. And I remember my father telling me that they were getting ready to leave about the time we left Jacksonville, a year or so later. We had a river adventure in Jacksonville, which was kind of fun. My buddies and I used to we used to paddle on a small raft that I made, which was made up of life rings, that is to say, canvas rings that you would wear around your waist, but they snapped in front. And so if you unsnapped them and filled them full of air, they would look somewhat like a log. And then we would put some boards across a bunch of them and then tie them all together in figure eights and then get some other small boards for paddles. And we would paddle up and down the St. Johns River, enjoying ourselves, looking for snakes and things of that nature. Well, one day we decided to paddle, my buddy and I decided to paddle all the way out into the middle of the St. Johns River, thinking that it was safe, and the wind picked up. And the whitecaps started on the water, and we decided it was time to turn around and get on back to our dock. Well, wouldn't you know it, my friend got chicken and started crying and wouldn't help me. So I decided that the best way to make headway was to just jump in the water and take our tie-up rope and put it in my mouth and just swim as hard as I could back towards our dock. Well, somebody saw us and in those officers' houses, and sure enough, around the corner comes a rescue boat, big rescue boat from the Naval Air Station, antennas flying, water flying from the bow. And they pulled up next to us, and a couple of nurses-looking ladies pulled us in and covered us in blankets. And I told them to please remember to tie up my boat and bring it with us. And they took us not back to my dock, but they took us back to the Admiral's dock, which was next door. And lo and behold, there was the Admiral and his family. There was my family, other people, other lookers-on, and there in the background was my father standing, just scowling. He was really mad that the Taylor family was embarrassed by this endeavor. But we got rescued, and that didn't slow us down very much. We still had all kinds of things to do. One thing we did was there was a relatively small naval hospital not far away from our house, and we and my sister and her friends and my friends, we got together and put together a little singing Broadway show. And we went over there and did a little dance and shuffle and singing for the soldiers, I guess they were, certainly. And I remember the one song that we sang was "Kiss Me Once and Kiss Me Twice and Kiss Me Once Again. It's been a long, long time." And at the time, you don't think about it, but here these guys are. They'd come back from the war, and they were in the hospital. And the last thing they wanted was for children to sing that song. They wanted their wives and girlfriends to be singing that song. Yeah. We would hunt snakes along the riverbank, my buddies and I. And we would have a good time doing that, because we would take a forked stick and a hatchet, and we would just patrol. And if we saw snakes, we would stop on our bicycles, get off, and catch the snake behind the head with the forked stick, and then chop it into 3 or 4 pieces and leave it. Now, we wouldn't attack mamas with babies who would be sunning on the rocks, but because that wouldn't be gentlemanly, but we would get the other-pins. When we weren't doing that, there were 2 areas that we would go to back behind. It must have taken us at least 15 minutes to ride our bicycles through dirt roads to get to the back side of NAS. And one of the places was where they were storing World War II aircraft, and there were just rows of them, rows and rows. And it was an absolute, it was like Disney World for young boys. We would get off our bikes, we'd climb up in those airplanes, sit in the pilot seats, wiggle the sticks, watch the ailerons and the rudders flip back and forth. We would go back and sit where the machine guns normally would be and pretend that we were flying over Germany or something. And just had a wonderful time. Occasionally we would find a leather helmet or maybe a oxygen breathing tube, but not much. And the shore patrol would come by every so often, and we would have to lay low so we wouldn't get kicked out. And when their Jeep would pass on by, we'd pop back up and continue our fun. Not far away was a firing range where young sailors were being taught to repair the machine guns that were found in airplanes and in the airplane wings. And at the end of their lessons, they would come out to this firing range, and the instructors would put some kind of a fault into their machine guns, and then they would have to come out of the classroom and take it apart and find what the problem was, fix it, and then their reward was they got to shoot. And they got to shoot 30 caliber and 50 caliber ammunition up onto a big hillside. Well, that was just too much for us. We waited for the red flag to be flying, which meant danger, stay away. And we would creep around the backside of that big hill, and we would lie against it. And if we were lucky, we would get there at the time that the young sailors were being rewarded with machine gun firing. And the hill would just vibrate as the bullets went into it. And then we would lie there with big smiles on our faces and slowly work ourselves a little bit further up to the top, so that occasionally a bullet would blow up some dirt, and the dirt would fly over onto us. And of course, that was the greatest thing. We would just love that. And then when they finished firing, they would police the area as best they could and pick up things. And then they would leave in their trucks and jeeps. And then we would go over to where the firing was, and we would collect things that they had missed, like brass shells and the links in an ammunition chain, and they had a machine over there, a mechanical device, where you could lay the bullets in, and you could lay the links of the bullet stuff in, and then you could go click, click, and the bullets would ram up inside the links. And then if you were lucky, you could build yourself like a 3-foot long ammunition chain and carry that around your neck. And if you were really lucky, you could go back into that hillside and dig for the heads of the bullets. And you could find bullets that weren't hurt. And you could take them and with a little bit of effort, you could push them back into the brass. And now you had a complete 30 caliber, 20 rounds hanging around your neck. And you were so proud. That was pretty much about all we did in Jacksonville. A lot of fun, though. Oh, I was a boxer, and that held me in good stead later on. There was a Navy Juniors boxing league, and we would box each other. And then, of course, the sailors would have what they called smokers, where they would box each other. And we would precede them in the evening, early on, with our antics, and have an enjoyable time. And I was pretty good. I won several fights that I was in, which stood me in good stead later on in life when I had to box several more times. One time was in Jacksonville. Well, and one time was in Port Lyautey, Morocco, actually. So those were the 2 times right there. That was pretty neat. Let's see, what else do I have that would be a lot of fun? Sally and after Jacksonville, we went to Virginia Beach. And so Virginia Beach was okay, but we didn't do very much. We just had nice beach time and went to a couple of different schools, sang in a choir at the Episcopal Church for a while, and met my first girlfriend, gave her my basketball letter from Meadowbrook Elementary School. And then Dad got orders to French Morocco, which is North Africa. And he had been, before that, in command of a aircraft carrier. And then, of course, went to Morocco. And at Morocco, we landed at the Naval Air Station, and we lived at the bachelor officers' quarters upstairs, which was a very nice spread for the commanding officer. And my room was way up in the penthouse, which I loved, because you could look out over the whole area. And one day, I was lying in bed early in the morning, about 8 o'clock, and they were setting off dynamite nearby. They were not, I don't know what they were doing. I believe they were building my father's golf course. The Seabees were building my dad's golf course at the time, and clearing stuff out. Well, it so happens that our Arab houseboy had been cleaning big French windows upstairs in my place, and he had not put the pins back in the hinges. And so some of the repercussions of the explosions slowly loosened the windows, and I'm lying in bed and I'm looking up, and here's this entire French window coming down onto me. So I put my arm over my face, and it crashes down onto me, and I only get one, medium-sized cut on the inside of my arm, fortunately. So I shake everything off, and I go downstairs, and I try to tell, my mother's sitting there having coffee, and I'm trying to tell her what happened upstairs, and all she's saying is, don't get any blood on the rug. And so, I don't know, I think Sally probably repaired me on that one. But that was Morocco. We did have other fun too, Sally and I. We used to ride horseback. We were real good friends with the Arab boys that ran the stables. And I had a special affection for going down to the hangars and mixing with the sailors down there. And I would either ride in the Jeep, the little Jeeps that said, follow me, and would take airplanes out or bring them in. And that would be fun. And they would let me talk on the radio. Or sometimes I would be in the Quonset hut that had a radio system in it, where they would talk to people worldwide. And that was enjoyable to sit and listen to the guys do that. Also, I used to ride occasionally in the fire engines if I happened to be at the firehouse when an alarm came off. And I would jump on there with them and ride. That was cool. Let's see. My brother, Richard, I haven't even mentioned him yet. He, I guess, was in something like the first grade, second grade. And he stayed, of course, at the Naval Air Station, Port Lyautey, French Morocco. But my sister and I, because the school system was so bad there, were sent away by my parents very wisely to a beautiful international school in Geneva, Switzerland. Oh, but before I left, I wanted to tell you one of my boxing experiences was when I went into the French schools in Port Lyautey with one of the other Navy juniors, and he took me there for a day at school. When we had recess at about 10 o'clock, he and I were out walking around talking, and there were about 4 Arab boys that came up to us, and we could tell that they meant trouble. So we were off in the corner at that time, and I told this friend of mine, I said, well, looks like we're just going to have to stand back to back like the cowboys used to, and tell them to come on. Well, he said that he'd do that, and he stood there, and I picked out the tallest Arab, and I told him to come on, and he did, and I took my professional boxing stance, and I hit him with about 2 or 3 shots, and he fell down, and all the other boys ran away. So that really did serve me well. And that was at Port Lyautey. I don't think we did much else in Port Lyautey. I used to wander down into the fields down near the river, which was called the Wadi Sabu, and they had a big antenna farm set up down there, where apparently the Navy was collecting all kinds of radio intelligence that was in the air along the Mediterranean area. So I didn't know that. Oh, one thing that was, remember I told you I used to hang out at the hangar? Well, I used to hang out at the hangar, and we had there some patrol bombers, some privateers, they were called. And so I got to be friends with some of the guys there. And one day I was down there, and they were very sad. And I said, what happened? And he said, one of the patrol planes from, I think it was VP-26, was flying up off Russia, and the Russian fighters went up after him and shot him down. And they were unarmed, the American plane was. It was just collecting radio intelligence, but they got shot down and everybody was killed. So the guys were really bummed for a while. Oh, that's right. I also used to pack parachutes and life rafts down in the hangars. That was a lot of fun. And when I packed parachutes, there was always another sailor, always a sailor there that was observing what I was doing, because he was packing one right next to me. And it's a pretty simple procedure if you take it step by step. And so he was always checking over his shoulder to see what I was doing, because he had to sign off on the little card that goes in the parachute bag. So anyhow, from all that excitement, we went up to the International School of Geneva, which I will call Echolant. And Echolant is, since I was away at school, I decided that I wouldn't use the name Brent. It sounded too formal and staid. I decided I would use the name that the sailors used to call me. And they used to call me, "Hey, buddy." And so my name became Buddy. New country, new school, new name. So I was Buddy Taylor for the 2 years we were there. We had a very enjoyable time, Sally and I did. Things that stand out are, I had a girlfriend for at least one of those 2 years. We got to kiss and hold on to each other and all that kind of stuff. That was kind of cool. And I remember in 1948, one of my Jewish friends at school there, named Aki Friedman, came up to me all excited one day, saying that his people had formed a new country called Israel, that their ancient land had been returned to them from the British, which had been owning it for quite some time as part of Palestine, and the state of Israel was now in play, and he couldn't have been happier. In June of 1950, just before the school year was over, our second school year, where we would leave and not come back because Dad would have a change of orders, we heard that North Korea had invaded South Korea, and the U.S. was once again at war. I was discussing this event in the school library when the librarian, who was an elderly Russian lady, told us that coming to the aid of South Korea was a grave mistake, and that there would be losses, and that the Korean peninsula would be returned to the communist state. I always remember that. But it was a social eye-opener for us, because how many children at age, 14, have a confrontation with a true communist? So anyhow, my 2 years at Echolant they were a wonderful dream. Academics were stressed highly. Sports were fun, understated, and placed in their proper position, as they should be in schools. Sally and I got to travel through Europe and Switzerland. We hiked the hills and skied. Mr. Egloff was our instructor. Our mother would put us on. Oh, that's a good story. Our mom and dad would take us from Port Lyautey down to Casablanca, where we would get on an Air France aircraft and fly up to Lyon in France, where we would be met by a gentleman from the Cook Agency who would take us to lunch and then get us on the train, which would go to Geneva. And then once we got to Geneva, we were on our own because we knew that town good. Well, I think it was the second year, and Sally had somehow fallen madly in love with a young Marine with the security group whose Quonset huts were right next to ours. And she didn't want to go back to school. You know, here she was at that, whatever that age is, 15. So, unbeknownst to anybody, at the time, she had pre-planned to leave her passport back in Port Lyautey at our house. And when we got to Casablanca, she announced that she wasn't going to Geneva. And by the way, she didn't have a passport anyhow. And she wasn't going to get out of the car. Well, my dad wouldn't have any of that. So he told our Navy driver, a young sailor, to pick Sally up, put her over his shoulder. We'd grab her bags and march right through the airport terminal and right up to the check-in desk, where he put her down ceremoniously, and the people there knew us. And I don't even know that they asked for a passport. They may have, but it was no problem. We got on the airplane, flew on up to Lyon, went by the Les Douanes, the security in Lyon, and they knew us. Ah, les Taylor, they would say. Les petits Taylor, viens ici. So my sister was crushed. Crushed. We got all the way back to Geneva. Didn't even have to have a passport. That's a funny story. I like that story. Let's see, what happened? Oh, then our life was so enjoyable, and we were being educated so well, that in my case, my French was, I would say, totally fluent. At Ecolant, you went to class, and the class was either taught by a French-speaking teacher or an English-speaking teacher. And you had to catch on. If you were French, you better learn English in a hurry, and if you were American, you better learn French in a hurry, because they weren't waiting for you. And so my language picked up rather quickly, I think better than Sally's did. But I can still remember the day when I realized that I was no longer translating in my head, but actually thinking in French. And that was really something. The culture shock of coming to Texas public school was almost too much to bear. When we got back in Texas, and I guess it was September of '50, and we were there for a couple of years, we went to a brand new high school called W.B. Ray. The W.B. Ray Fighting Texans. And all they cared about was having a football team that would beat the old school in town, which was H.E. Butt. And it was so degrading to come back to something like that. And we told Mom and Dad, both of us, that it was, as a matter of fact, I was taking a French class, and for some reason the French teacher didn't show up a lot of time, and I would just get up and teach the French class. It was just no problem. But anyhow, our parents got the word, and my dad, I think, either knew or suspected he was going to be going back to Washington, D.C. for duty. So he sent my sister and me back to that area to go to boarding school and await the arrival of our parents. And my sister went to Mount Vernon Seminary. Anyhow, I went to Severn School up in Annapolis, outside of Annapolis, Maryland, on the Severn River. And it was good. It was, heavy on education. And you expected to act like a gentleman, do your work, and I appreciated it. It was very good. I'm going to take a small break right now. I'm going to go to pause. Now, Severn School was a private boys' school in the countryside on the edge of the Severn River. A very nice location. It has since changed entirely, but at the time it was set up by Mr. Roland Teal for the express purpose of getting boys into college, and particularly getting boys into the Naval Academy. So my parents heard about it that way, and that's how Severn School in Severna Park, Maryland was chosen for me. Once again, it was a good school. I was there for 3 years, sophomore, junior, and senior. Had a lot of things going on. I loved to participate in school activities. We only had 3 sports at that school because it wasn't very big. We probably only had, a couple hundred at the most children. The sports were football in the fall, wrestling in the winter, and lacrosse in the spring. And so I took on all 3 of those because what the heck, why not? It was really good. After a couple of years, I dropped wrestling because that's doing that road work and stuff is really tough. But I stayed with football, and I ended up senior year being one of 2 quarterbacks, which is nice. I also did a lot of activities. For some reason, I just caught on, and I was president of the student council and editor of the yearbook. I was editor of the school newspaper that we put out about once a month. And I'm sure, although I didn't think of it as helping my resume to get to college, I'm sure that it did, because I think I got favorable responses from all the colleges I applied to. But since we didn't have a college program at the school where you could go sit and talk with a counselor and look through books and catalogs, I just picked some of the biggest schools that I ever heard of, because what the heck. So I think, as I'm looking back, I made application to University of California and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute because they had a good lacrosse program, and Cornell, Princeton University, and the Naval Academy. Well, it turns out that I guess secretly I did want to go to the Naval Academy, and so that's where I did end up. And all my energy was in sports and school activities. I didn't date at all those 3 years. I don't know. There weren't very many girls around, and the guys who competed for the few girls that there were had to waste a lot of time going down to the bus stop, sitting and waiting for the girls from St. Mary's, Annapolis, to come back home in the afternoon and all that, and I just wasn't going to get into that. Let's see, that's about it for, we had a couple of activities that I remember telling Chris and Sally about. If you got demerits at Severn, you had to work them off. And the way you worked them off was you either filled in potholes in the road, or you worked digging around a huge tree that had been cut off as a stump, and that they were getting eventually rid of the stump. But in order to do that, they wanted to dig way, way down. And they had this unlimited manpower. All you had to do was get a demerit, and you ended up with a shovel digging 6 feet below ground level until this tree trunk and its supporting roots were all exposed. And then apparently, although I didn't see it, professional help came in and cut the roots. And they said the tree dropped down, and then they covered it up with all the dirt again. And so that's how they got rid of that very large stump at minimum price. But I remember keeping the road out there. This is the road that was between the school campus. It split the school campus and paralleled the river. And it did need a lot of help. Recently, I noticed, having gone back to Severn, it's all paved now. But Severn is a hoity-toity kind of school now. It's all very high-class, pre-K through senior year, boys and girls day school. Very successful, very expensive, lots of good teams and activities. So it's a super school now, if you got the money. So on to the Naval Academy. That's my next one. And I'll try to get through that pretty quickly. I remember the first summer, because you have to join the Naval Academy in essentially June. And so you're there for the whole summer before the academic year. And all I can remember is calisthenics, obstacle courses, marching, running, learning to shoot pistols, rifles, wrestling, and more marching. That was plebe summer. Oh, and you got to learn to sail too, which was really good. Because plebe year, your freshman year, you couldn't talk to girls at all. But your next year, your sophomore year, which was called youngster year, it was a real chick magnet to be able to take girls out sailing on the Severn River. And we did that a lot. That was plebe summer. Plebe year was the usual. Got yelled at a lot, fussed at. It's like you couldn't do anything right. And you had to just constantly tell yourself, I can get through this. Everybody else has gotten through this, and so can I. I think my greatest indignity was that one of the seniors, first classmen they were called, made me go and get up 5 minutes before reveille in the morning and go sit on a toilet so that the seat would be warm for him when he got up at reveille and ran into the bathroom. I always remembered that, and it was a good lesson of what not to do, with sailors and junior officers below you. Just always remember how you were treated. So let's see what else. I played soccer and the fall, my first year, and swimming. Swimming was the second sport in the winter, and lacrosse was my third sport in the spring. You might as well play sports because you couldn't go into town except for a few hours on Saturday afternoon. So what the heck? And you only got paid, I think it was $5 a month. So, you weren't getting anything out of that either. My youngster year, I was so excited because I finally passed Russian. I didn't tell you about Russian yet. Remember I told you I was fluent in French? It would have been so easy to take French at the Naval Academy and breeze through that particular series of courses. But oh no, I had to save the world. I had to take Russian. Because Russian is what you would need if you ever ran into them later on in a war. So I barely passed Russian. It was very difficult. The Cyrillic alphabet was nothing like the Latin alphabet that you use in French and Spanish and Portuguese and Italian. And I guess I could have gotten kicked out at some point if I had not just barely passed. But it did take time away, and it took time away from some of my sports. And I realized my second year that I was not good enough to make varsity level soccer, but I swam still and played lacrosse. My grades were pretty good, except for Russian, of course. And then my junior year, which is called second class year, I lost out on varsity level at swimming, but I still played lacrosse. And of course, I was dating during that time, and I did have a little bit of money, and you did get, of course, talk to girls and date them and walk out in town on Saturdays and Sundays. That was cool. My last year there, my senior year, first class year, I lost out my varsity level in lacrosse. I just couldn't make it. So I shifted to brigade level lacrosse, which is still very tough, and played well there, did a good job. My grades were good, and I graduated principally because of my poor Russian and my mediocre math and science capabilities. I graduated about 600 out of 800. Or 600 out of 900, I guess it was. So that wasn't too high. But it was high enough for me to get a first pick of what I was looking for in a ship. I wanted a small ship, a destroyer, that would zoom around and teach me all about, about controlling the ship and handling lines and some engineering skills and things of that nature. And the USS Pickering out of Long Beach, California was a perfect example. We went out and had a couple of runs in the Western Pacific, went up to Korea, went down to the Philippines, went to Japan several times. And I knew that area pretty well by the time I left it. One day, when we were back in Long Beach, a submarine came and tied up next to our ship. And I had the duty that day, so I wandered down, and it was quiet on both ships. And I found the officer in charge and talked to him a bit, and he was cool, laid back. Had a good crew that was smart. They took me around the ship, showing me everything, and I could tell that these young sailors knew a whole lot more than just what they needed to know for their particular Navy job. They knew the ship really well, and I was impressed with that. They were knowledgeable and relaxed, just my type. So I went back and applied to submarine school. And took my papers to the executive officer, and he said, "Hell no." He said, "We just qualified you to control the ship and to do all kinds of things, and now you're finally doing a good job and paying us back. I'm not going to send you away." So I waited about 6 months, and I reapplied. And this time I took it to the commanding officer, which was not the right thing to do, but I did. And the commanding officer said, okay, because there had been many messages at that time regarding the buildup of the submarine force in the Navy. They were obviously going to be the ship of the future. So I got to go to submarine school, New London, Connecticut, in the fall of 1960. It was great. I enjoyed it. I found out that arriving at submarine school, New London, Connecticut, in the summer was a really good idea. I was in submarine class. There were 2 classes a year, and I had the class that started, as I said, in the summer. It was hard work, a lot of memorization, a lot of going out on the submarines during the days, a lot of classroom training. But the best part was that right across the river was Connecticut College for Women. And in the summertime, it was the artsy-craftsy girls that would be over there doing dance and poetry and things of that nature. And they're always fun to date. So we would go with them and pick them up, take them out to the beach, and we'd sit at the beach, drink beer, eat sandwiches, and they would quiz us from our Navy books. And they would make us sit and describe step by step each of the procedures involved in submerging a submarine and surfacing and starting the engines and getting ready to make a torpedo attack and all these different things. And we loved it and we learned it. And they laughed and had a great time. So we were there for 6 months. I chose a Charleston, South Carolina submarine called the Darter because it was modern. It was newer than the older subs, although it was still a diesel sub. It was very modern, and had a wonderful time on that ship. And I also met Betty Ann Lancaster, who was working in the blood lab at the hospital in Charleston. And we dated for a good while. I took off for a run up to off the Russian coast, where we played some Sneaky Pete stuff with the Russian fleet and enjoyed ourselves very much. Had a great time. When we were up spying on the North Fleet in the winter, something happened that was really quite interesting. As I said earlier, we were copying communications and looking at their ships. So our commanding officer wanted to get a little bit closer. And so at the time I had the con, and I had put the periscope up, and I was looking around and just checking out where the ships were out in front. And all of a sudden I swung the periscope around, and I saw a Russian destroyer coming toward us. And I said, oh man, somehow they've seen our periscope or one of our antennas. We were really in trouble. And before I could say that and get it out to the crew, I saw the Russian ship firing its gun and really moving fast and firing its gun a second time. And we said, oh man. And so just before we dove deep again, I swung the periscope back around, and I looked and I saw that they had a Russian tugboat towing a big floating target. And that destroyer was actually shooting at the target. And we just happened to have been popped up in the middle of the range. And it looked like we were getting shot at. And of course we weren't. But we did go down, we did call the captain to the con, and we did get down there and catch our breath for a while. But that was kind of exciting. I remember that. Then we came back to Charleston, and in 1962, married Betty Ann. let's see, what else after that, I was assigned to the submarine squadron in Charleston. So I had a shore job, so to speak, although it was on a ship. The big old repair ship didn't go anywhere. And so that was really nice to have that as your next duty when you're a young married person. Before that happened, though, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis strike. And at that time, I was a weapons officer on Darter, as I said, and we had unloaded everything from our ship, with the exception of 2 defensive torpedoes in the after torpedo room. Everything in the forward torpedo room were mines, but they were fake mines. We were just practicing laying a minefield. So we were out off Charleston laying a minefield, and we found out that the Cuban Missile Crisis had started and ships were going down there and it was going to be so exciting. And we said, we're coming back in and loading up our torpedoes, because we'd already fired our mines and laid our field. And they said, no, you stay out there. It's too busy here. Well, about 2 or 3 days later, they said, okay, you can come on back to the repair ship. And when we did, it was just a madhouse. I mean, there were submarines tied up everywhere. We found out that all the submarines from Key West, Florida, were put up there to get them out of the way. And the Marines were running up and down the street yelling Marine Corps songs, because they had just come down from Lejeune in big transport ships, and they were prepared to go land in Cuba. And it was the wildest place for a while that I ever saw, until everything finally settled down and the crisis was over. But the American submarines were not allowed anywhere near Cuba, because the American Navy wanted to prosecute any submarine they found, and if they found them, they were going to do naughty things to them, like throw hand grenades down into the water after them and things like that, which they did to a number of Russian submarines. And it was pretty serious. So after that, I was off to, in 1964, for 2 years, I was off to the guided missile school in Virginia Beach, where I first went to class and learned all about the navigation and the missiles of the big new Polaris submarines that were being built at that time. And then I stayed on as an instructor, and I taught for another year and a half or so, after which I was sent down as the navigator of the Stonewall Jackson. Now, the Stonewall Jackson was stationed in Hawaii. That's where all the families were. But the ship itself was physically out in Guam. So we got to Hawaii and we scratched around finding a house and everything. And then I kissed Betty Ann goodbye, and she had a baby in her arms and a little boy by her side. And I told her, find a house, buy it, do what you want. I got to get out of here. And I left town. Not a very nice thing to do when you look back on it as an old man. But anyhow, we finally came back to Charleston, and I was the number 2 officer, the executive officer on board the submarine Chivo. And we had a really nice crew, but a very tough skipper. And he was always on me, and it was just a mismatch. It was like it just shouldn't have happened. And I could tell that my reports going back to Washington were not going to be of the caliber that would allow me to get a command of a submarine. I was very sad during that period of time, but there was nothing you could do but just tighten up, get it done. After that, I went to Washington, to the Strategic Systems Project Office, where I was an inspector of Polaris submarines, both American and British, and we had a very good time, particularly when we would go down to Cape Canaveral and inspect the submarines down there before they would go out and shoot their missiles. And so we'd take our family down and go to Disney World and all that, and it was a very enjoyable 2-year tour. It was followed by another Washington tour where I was at the Navy Security Station up by George Washington University. And it was a boring paperwork job, and I didn't really like it that much. And on top of that, the Navy had just gotten into, this is in like 1972, the Navy had just gotten into sensitivity training because blacks and women were coming into the Navy in larger numbers than, of course, had ever occurred before. And so we had to sit through these long, boring lectures telling us how bad we white folks were and how we had to be sensitive to women, take down all our pinups, stop talking dirty, no more jokes. You had to be treating all the blacks as equals as well, which in those days was just happening. But, you know, we got it done. We got it done. It was not all that bad, and I found out after 2 years there that my last job in the Navy was going to be a really good job. And being a good boy, because I'd done a good job at the security station, I was rewarded with my what they call twilight tour, which means your last tour in the military. And they sent me to Northwood, England, which is just outside of London. And we had a super time. My job was that of a safety controller for the waters nearby Europe, in particular, for submarine usage of all nations, to make sure that no two submarines would be in the same spot of water running along that could possibly hit each other or anything like that. So it was chunks of water were given to different ships from different nations at different times, and it was all run through my office, where we had 2 officers and about 4 enlisted men. And it was very interesting because not only did I do that, but I got a chance to work with the Brits, and British guys are really cool. And I got to work with NATO forces, French forces. I got to travel. Jeff and Greg had a wonderful time there, I think, and so did Betty Ann. We did historical travels and visited, must have visited half the graveyards and castles in England, Wales, and Scotland. We just had a great time. We even skied in Scotland. And then that was it. And I retired from the Navy in the summer of 1978. 20 years after graduating from the Naval Academy. And then after hanging around our house on Gainsborough Drive in Fairfax, Virginia for a month or 2, Betty Ann told me to get out from under her feet and go get a job. So I had one interview at the time. That's all I went after because it looked good. And it was an interview with Raytheon submarine missiles people. And it was right down in Crystal City near the Washington airport. And I did that job under different contracts for about 20 years. And I stayed there the whole time. Had a very good time. So that was from 78 to 98. Betty Ann and I intended to retire in the March of 98. when both of us would be 62. But she died suddenly in her sleep on October 9th, 1997. So we were about 6 months shy. I retired in January and went and told my boss that, I went and told my boss, of course, in October and November that my heart wasn't in my work anymore. I just didn't want to do it. And I would be leaving the company. So I officially retired the 1st of January and set about being busy on my own, visiting friends in America and in Greece, actually, and sailing with my buddy Don Shelton up around Newport and out around Chesapeake Bay, hiking the trails of New England and the Carolinas, and participating in some AARP work projects that I did for several years. So that's pretty much it. And then on one of my trail hiking preparations, I met Christina Ann Flynn, and I met her up at Cayuga, North Carolina, which is near Hendersonville, North Carolina, where we went back later and selected our wedding rings. And we just hit it off right away and walked the hills and talked and took a automobile trip up through the Blue Ridge Parkway, and then I came back and dropped her off, and then I went off again to my hiking venture and called her on the phone, I guess most every day. And then I let her know that I was coming back that Friday afternoon, and or Saturday, whichever it was, and that I was bringing lunch, and I would meet her at Cayuga. We'd go sit down by the lake and talk. And that, as they say, is the beginning of something grand. And that's kind of where we stand right now, because I think you guys have been very, very patient in listening to me for an hour and 1 minute, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.